Welcome to the Alberta Craft Beer podcast, aka the AbBeerGuide podcast. My name is Andrew, and I'm one of the people behind the Alberta Craft Beer Guide. And our goal is simple: we want to grow the craft beer community. We do this by educating the interested and entertaining the entrenched. Our guest today is young Andrew of Winning Wines Plus on the Southside of Edmonton. It's the go-to homebrew shop in the city and surrounding areas. I know people drive quite a ways to come get your knowledge and your services. And he's been in the game for a number of years, which we will get into. But thanks for coming on the show, Andrew.
I'm happy to be here. Very happy to be here. And I'm glad that there's no confusion over our names.
Yes. All the cool people are named Andrew, but of course. So normally I dive right into things and start asking about your brand because normally I drink a beer from, the brewery that I'm chatting with. You're not a brewery, you're a homebrew supply and wealth of knowledge station. You requested a beer, you have a beer. Do you want to talk about that and pour it up? And
sure, why not? It's 2:45, so yeah, I'm up for a beer.
Beautiful.
This was one of my favorites, Dark Island from the Orkney Isles.
Yep.
And it's one of the very drinkable beers from Scotland. Being that it's only 4.6% alcohol. So, you can chug a couple of these and still, you still make a meal.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open that right now.
Cool.
And just know that being in the store, we've got staff here working away. So bear in mind, I feel really bad and guilty about drinking beer while they're working.
Someone's got to do it. No, it's cool. He's in the back little office of the, there you go. Gorgeous.
Yeah.
So I'll cheer. This is, old engine oil. Have you ever had such a beer?
No, but I think your beer and my beer are about the same color.
Yes. So mine's a black ale. This is from, Harveston Brewery.
Oh yeah.
And I've heard good things about it. I actually haven't had it before, but at Sherbrooke, they've had your beer for a long time. And then the pandemic set in. They haven't been able to bring it in since really the pandemic.
Is that a Canadian brewery?
This is in Scotland.
Oh, so both from Scotland.
Yeah. I tried. I couldn't find your beer you requested, but I did find something from the same country in Scotland. So these guys have been around since 1983. So cheers to foreign beers, I guess.
You're not going to believe this, but the name of the brewery, the head brewer of the Orkney Brewery, give me a guess.
Andrew.
You got it.
Yes. The old Andrew.
Yes, to Andrew.
Cheers. So some people know, some people don't know. Winning Wines has been on the scene for quite some time. Your location specifically. What makes your store unique? There's other homebrew shops, but yours is at the top of the list. What makes your store unique?
Well, I think many years ago we made the decision to run with not just wine supplies and wine kits, but to actually jump on that beer train. And as the popularity grew, we grew, and we could see that it wasn't going to stop. Mm-hmm. And then with the development of the Alberta craft brewing industry, which has just ballooned over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
We're just along for the ride. And to be quite honest, it's our customers who are driving it. So when Homebrewers Guild members or regular, members of the homebrewing community come in and ask for a specific product, we're happy to bring it in. And so it's very much a symbiotic relationship. Mm-hmm. That they ask and we provide. And so they're driving us really to the point where we've kind of filled up our 1,560 square feet here. We are pretty tight.
Yeah.
Most weeks. Yesterday we got a delivery of 3 tons of product. So the guys looked at me and said, "That's all very well, but where the hell are we going to put it?"
Yeah.
So we get pretty inventive about it. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. And the guys who work here, Mark, Bernie, and Jeff, they're all passionate about beer.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy to, to move the whole industry along. And a lot of the local craft breweries who have grown up, the nascent ones, they've come through the store in their early days, when they didn't have the room or the ability to buy a skid of grain. They'll come to us and ask us, if we can provide smaller amounts, and we're happy to.
Of course.
So really, the industry has pushed us, and we're happy to go along. It's crazy busy.
Yeah. Just to touch on your staff really quick. I mean, I'm blown away every time I go in your store, because I'm not a home brewer, but I have many friends who are actively homebrewing. I can name 3 off the top of my head who I know have carboys bubbling away in their basements or in the proper room. Anytime I've gone in there, I've learned a ton. Or, you get a phone call and the type of questions that customers are asking, very specific about certain, products or fermentation, whatever it is. And your staff always has answers. It's amazing.
Well, as I say, we've got a huge knowledge base. As you know, Mark is kind of a man about town for beer, anything beer, right?
Yeah.
Jeff, he has actually, he owned a brew on premise in Ontario.
Oh,
so
cool.
He's very, very familiar with making wine and beer on site for people.
Yeah.
And this was years before Alberta considered, opening up what they call ferment on premise. And so he's very familiar with, the brew on premise end of the business and retail. So we're lucky to have him, and we're happy to have him. And there are occasionally questions. In fact, we had one this afternoon that kind of stumped us all. So we enjoy using, the Google and various other resources to get the information. And so we're constantly learning too. So it's interesting for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to talk about some of the products you have, I mean, like you said, if you don't have something and someone wants it, you'll bring it in. But obviously you've got lots of like import grains, like from overseas.
Yeah.
You're supplying, you work with all the small maltsters. Do you have all their stuff too? You have Red Shed for sure, right?
We do. The local maltsters that we carry are Red Shed, Origin, and 3D out of Camrose.
Yep, cool.
And, we would welcome carrying more, but as I said, it's kind of space. If we had a mezzanine floor, it would be full. Yep. And as you know, you walk in the store and there's a lot of stacking. Actually, you can see behind me there, just off the ceiling, right? So space is a consideration. But yeah, we carry approximately 69 different varieties of hops in pelletized forms, about the same number of specialty malts from around the world, the US, Europe, Canada. And then our base malts, we have Canadian base malts in sacks, half sacks, kilos, and then a lot of European base malts like Marisada, Golden Promise. But more and more, we are carrying products that homebrewers are looking for that are locally produced. So like you say, malting companies, local malting companies.
Yeah. And then have you entertained local hops just yet or not quite?
Funny you should mention that.
Let me guess, was it Hard Hells that came through or no?
I've got the card right here. I mean, there's been a few. There's several small ones, yeah. But these guys came through the other day, and I am meeting with them to see what they have, and it's called Hound Dog hops out of Wetaskiwin.
Oh, cool.
There's another couple of companies that are doing, or farmers that are doing small hop yards.
Yep.
And of course, we all know about Northern Girls, just
Yep.
west of the city. They're, because pelletized hops are quite compact, that is what we carry.
Yeah.
If we carried the same amount of whole hops as we do pelletized hops, it would be impossible.
Yeah.
But to have someone like Northern Girls or Hound Dog Hops or whoever locally, we now have the ability to buy from them in whole hop flowers or whole hop cones.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we might look at that. We do once a year bring in whole hops from fresh hops in Oregon.
Cool.
And we bring that in exclusively for the Homebrewers Guild. And actually the order is being placed tomorrow. So we'll bring whole hops in for them.
Cool. Very cool. And last big ingredient, yeast. I know you do a specialized yeast order every month, or how does that work for people who don't know?
We actually will place you on the specialized hop order, yeast order whenever you come in. We order about every 3 weeks, and we're bringing in between 350 and 450 yeast cultures each time from Yeast. And, you know, to keep the rotation so they're nice and fresh, that 3 week is kind of a sweet spot for maintaining freshness, because as you know, yeast is a key component, and it needs to be fresh.
Yeah. Now, if someone's not going through all the route, maybe they want to dive into homebrew. You have kits that are like the easiest way possible. You basically buy it and pitch yeast essentially, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we did used to have 2 different types. One that was produced by the same company who produces our wine kits, RJ Spagnol's, and it was called I forget what it was called. Anyway, they stopped producing it for whatever reason. But the other product that we've carried for several years now is out of Saskatchewan, and it's called Paddock Wood is the brewery, and Ready Brew is the beer kit, and it's 23 liters of beer wort that they produce. It's interesting in that they are a craft brewery, and they produce beer for restaurants and pubs in and around Saskatchewan.
Yep.
And several years ago, they decided that it was possible for them to hot bag just straight wort. So the kits that we have in stock are exactly the same as the beers that they produce in kegs and cans. And so they changed the name so that there's no direct correlation between their product. For example, their commercial product for a pale ale, their flagship IPA is 606.
Yep.
So in the Ready Brew kit, they just reversed it and called it 909. They produce Bête Noire, I think, is one of their commercial products. And for us, it's called Black Panther Lager. So same product, different name.
Yeah.
But you're right, they're so easy for people to get into home brewing. Once they have the equipment, they literally just pour 23 liters into their primary, sprinkle the yeast on or pour the yeast in. And it's basically a 14-day process until you're actually drinking it. So for people entering home brewing, it's so good and it's so easy.
Cool.
And then we'll, if they want to, we'll move them on to using some grain. Yeah.
All grain. And now, do you also sell milled grain, or will you mill it for someone? Is that a possibility at your shop?
We have beer kits that are all grain beer kits, and they're already milled.
Gotcha. You just
and they come complete with yeast, bottling sugar, hops, and then the ready milled grain. Cool. They're made up to order for us, and again, we rotate those very quickly out of here.
Yeah.
But we do have the ability to rent people a mill that they can take home.
Yeah.
And mill their product. Or if need be, they can actually purchase the grain here, and then we have a mill here that they can use. And we just ask that they bring a cordless drill to power the mill. Yeah. And so they can come in here and mill their grain and then to their recipe, and then take it home and produce.
Cool. Very cool. Make it as easy as possible for people. I won't dive too deep into the other stuff you have because this is obviously a beer focused thing. But for those looking to adventure, I know you said you obviously started off in wine and wine kits. And as of recent, you have distilling equipment as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I think
for not for alcohol purposes, obviously for essential oils and purification of water naturally.
Yeah. Well, obviously since March last year, when many more people were at home, they were initially looking for hobbies. So sourdough bread was one of the big ones that everybody was making. Yep. Cheese, yogurt.
All the fermentation, really.
Yeah, and any home craft. So, obviously we were very, very lucky in that our business did not suffer from the COVID. Mm-hmm. People were interested in getting into home brewing. Yep. But there was definitely an uptick in distilling, as you say, for essential oils and hand sanitizer and other products.
Race car fuel. You were allowed to distill your own race car fuel with your license. Yeah. Anyway,
you're right. Distilling has become a big, big thing, and of course, craft distillers in and around Alberta, there's been a big growth in them. Yeah. But I should mention that the interesting thing is we've been in business as a group for 36 odd years, and when we started, our trade name was and still is Brew Crew. And back then, beer was the big product. And then that morphed into wines. So the focus shifted from beer making in the little cans of malt that we all are familiar with, yep, into winemaking. And as winemaking developed, we decided that it was kind of stupid to have a name that conjures up beer when we were selling primarily wine kits.
Yeah.
So we changed our trade name over the stores to Winning Wines Plus.
Cool.
Ironically, now the focus has shifted again to beer. Yeah. So, for that reason, any of your advertising you see, it will say Winning Wines Plus, and then underneath it'll still reference the Brew Crew folks.
That makes sense. Just to touch on your distillery thing really quick. I've been tracking, because eventually we'll do a book that'll cover these things. But like for breweries in Alberta, we had like 36 open in 2018 for breweries, and then only 22 open in 2019. And I don't think I fully updated this, but we had probably another 10 or 12 open, like breweries open in 2020. For distilleries, we actually had a big uptick. Like 2016, we had about 10, 2017, only a couple. 2018, we had 9. 2019 was a big year where we opened 16.
Wow, that's a lot.
And then even 2020, we still opened 13 distilleries. So we're really on the uptick. Now, some of those are just production facilities, and then they're putting away whiskey for 5 years, 10 years. We'll see how that goes. But it's definitely not slowing down in beer and distilling world. And when there's more professionals doing it, you're also going to get more hobbyists doing it and vice versa, or those, the amateurs going pro. And that actually segues to my next little point. I don't know if you want to name names or not, but I think it's kind of neat because I've met some people in your shop that have gone on to open up breweries. What do you think it's like for them? Like, can you just tell they're getting pretty serious one day about how much beer they're making? And are you like, hey, are you going pro? Or do they ask you advice? Or how does that kind of come to be? What's your observation on
it? It's funny you should mention that because many of them have come through the store. And it's great. Like they start off as homebrewers. And then you can get a sense of when they're starting to get a little serious by what they're purchasing, volume-wise.
Yeah.
But most of them are quite guarded about plans, understandably.
Sure.
And then one day, once the license is in place or the building is leased, then they feel comfortable saying, "Oh, and by the way, we will be opening up a brewery." And so you know, we get to hear kind of in the early stages, and we do get a feel for it. But I mean, it's a natural progression, really. I mean, there's been a lot of people in the last year who have lost their employment. And so, you know, if they are home brewers and, you know, they've got some backing, financial backing, then maybe they've come to the decision, you know what, I want to be able to look after myself and not be at the whim of, you know, the big company. And so they've said, the heck with it. I'm throwing care to the wind, and we're going to open up a brewery. Many of them have. I feel a little sad about, you know, COVID coming along and maybe taking the wind out of their sails a little bit, but they've been very, very inventive in surviving and very resilient. I think they'll come out of this even stronger, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I agree. And I know for a fact that there's a number of breweries who they've been even busier since all these things came into play. There's been a shift to more local. We've been in it for so long, but, you know, a bigger mass shift of support local, support your local breweries, drink what's in the neighborhood, drink what's in the city kind of thing. And also through restaurants and other shopping. So I know there's a bunch of breweries who they've invested in canning lines to control more of their production and their costs. They're getting more tanks, they're expanding, they're adding on more staff, they're producing more beer, they're selling more beer now without a tap room than they were before. Right. It's not the case for everyone, but I definitely know there are some big positives for a lot of businesses.
Yeah, and of course, of it, right? What we must mention too is the exposure. And I mean, you're a big part of that, right? Alberta Craft Beer Guide. I know we've been in it since day one.
Yes, and we love you for that.
And I will get you your your next ad.
Yes, that's important.
Jogged my memory the other day. Yeah. But yeah, the exposure. I mean, through advertising and definitely the provincial government, maybe not the current, but the previous provincial government, were behind the craft brewing scene, and you know, that really helped it develop. And it's really quite something when you look at other provinces. Alberta has really, really forged ahead with this industry and employed a lot of people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's great. The more beer you buy, the more they need to make, and then the more people they need. I got to see Sea Change not too long ago, and there was a bunch more staff in the building because they're producing way more beer and they need help, and they're growing and working on all these different things and packaging, and it's cool. It's great to see. There's definitely a boom. It's a booming industry, and it's one that is not going to go away anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which is great. So we'll talk about this before we're going to talk about how you got into beer, which is always a great story. But let's talk about how you got into the homebrew shop game, because you took over Winning Wines in 1995, correct?
The store was on 9th Street then, and yeah, I'll be brief. Back then, the provincial government was offering 94, 95 was offering buyouts because they wanted to reduce the government staff. And both Neil Herbst and I worked for the provincial government. And so at that time, they were offering a little incentive to leave. And both of us took the incentive. Neil, as you know, opened up Alley Cat, Neil and Levon, and ran with that since 95, I believe. And I took about a year to decide what I wanted to do. I looked at some options, but my neighbor where I lived was a home brewer and convinced me to try making beer. And I did. Coincidentally, the product that I purchased was from the store, the Brew Crew store on 9th Street. And just like the shaver guy who bought the company, Killer Shaver, whatever it was, the guy who decided to buy the company after, I decided, actually, at my wife's insistence, you know, just go and make them an offer for the store and see what happens. So I spoke with the then owner, and the rest is history. We moved the store from 9th Street in 96 annex to its present location to get the better parking and the better exposure. And we haven't looked back.
That's cool. That's very cool. That's amazing. And then just to paint a picture for those who maybe weren't drinking beer in 1995 for whatever reasons. At the time, I did a little bit of research. Like Big Rock was obviously on the scene. They started in the 80s. Alley Cat, like you mentioned, had just gotten started. I believe Flanagan and Sons was still around.
Yes. In 90, yes, they were. Yeah.
And then, you know, in 96 is when Wild Rose and Grizzly Paw came onto the scene. So there really wasn't that many breweries. Oh, Brewster's was around, of course.
And then Strathcona.
The second iteration of Strathcona, correct? But the original one was like in the 1905 or 1890.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, ironically, Strathcona Brewery was in a facility that was immediately behind where I worked when I worked for the provincial government. So maybe that influenced me somewhat too.
Yeah. What was that brewery like for those who don't know or even haven't heard of it, perhaps?
You know, they were in a little kind of standard office and overhead door kind of, you know, commercial facility.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I think they might have been doing some bottling, but they did a lot of keg sales.
Yeah.
But I do recall that during the summertime, our office, our lab where I worked, had a pretty nice barbecue out back, and we would make use of it at lunchtime.
Sure.
Well, some Fridays, that barbecue lunchtime kind of extended into maybe 5 or 6 or 11 o'clock at night, simply because the guys from the brewery across the way would be hungry, and of course we'd be thirsty. So we got together, and you know what happened.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really cool. So my next big question for you, which is always, this is my favorite question to ask people, is how did you get into beer? Where you started appreciating beer, and what was the scene like? What was the culture like? Where were you? Was there certain beers that got you into it? Because originally you're from the UK, you're from England. I imagine that's where you got into beer.
Yes. You know, it's funny because before my father passed away, he did actually mention that in our family tree way back, there was a brewer, someone who made beer commercially.
Yeah.
And so I guess beer is in my blood. And also, just about when I was emigrating, 1974, my father made the smart move to invest in a pub. He obviously waited until he knew I was emigrating to do that, because he knew I would be drinking most of the profits. But yeah, he had a pub in England for a few years, and it was the beer that he sold was Adnams, which is a Suffolk brewery. And in the early days, believe it or not, the beer that was in firkins, which is big oak barrels, 55 gallons, I think, was delivered occasionally on a brewer's dray, which was a cart and horse, actually 2 horses and 1 cart.
Yeah.
And it would be delivered. I mean, it sounds like I'm aging myself. Not really. I think it was more of an advertising thing for them. Once in a while, they would do this.
It's like a show when you know, oh, here comes, yeah, it's great. It grabs attention, it turns heads. Yeah.
It's like the Budweiser horses, right? But
sure. Yeah.
Maybe not on such a big scale.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he had a pub for several years, and whenever I went back there, I always helped out. So I think I've always had an interest in beer and brewing, and maybe it's been in the background, but you know, with the ability to get involved in it by selling products, yeah, it's very interesting. I don't think I'd like to be a brewer or brewing. Sure. That's not me, but I enjoy seeing other people develop their brewing skills.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe sometimes people are like, hey, Andrew, this turned out really well. You should try this.
Cool. You know, it's funny. I should just quickly show you this. Before my father got into the pub, he owned a restaurant in Exeter in Devon. and I helped him during my college days to renovate it. And it was actually a malt house, an old malt house.
Whoa.
But the one wall of the building formed the old Roman wall that went around the city of Exeter. So, you know, everything in England is old.
Yes.
And while we were renovating this place, we found all kinds of stuff within the building. And one of the things that I'm glad I retained was this old, I don't know if you can see that, it is an old book that we found in the rafters, tucked away in the rafters. And it says Barley something at the Bartholomew Street Malt House, which is where this was.
Yeah.
Well, there are entries in here from like 1767.
Whoa.
So I don't know if you can see that, but it was all written in pen.
Wow.
And it indicates how much barley came into the malt house.
Yeah.
And then they would subsequently malt it for the breweries.
That's incredible.
So they have all the names of the malting of the farmers and the amount of malt they brought in. This one's 1876 to 1877. So yeah, pretty significant little book. It's very fragile, and I keep it in a plastic bag. But yeah, it's, again, there's a connection there with beer, barley, malt.
Yeah. That's incredible. So one thing I've been learning in the last couple of months is about more English style beers, more pub culture in the UK and in Ireland. One book I was gifted for Christmas is this one called The Pub.
Oh yeah.
Which it profiles a bunch of, you know, traditional pubs, you know, just things you've seen before, I'm sure, all the wood and everything.
Right.
And then it has a list for, you know, towns, places where you can get, you know, traditional cask ale, and running pubs the right way. There's no TV screens and football games. It's all traditional stuff. And then a movie that stood out for me, it was based in the Republic of Ireland, but it was just called The Irish Pub, a movie. And it's a documentary where they interview pub owners of these traditional pubs that have been in the family or been around for, you know, 50 years, 100. Most of them are 100, 200 years old. And how it's partly a dying scene, whether because the town is aging and there's no population, so your base is getting smaller, or you're in a city and the city grows around you and people are forced to change. And there's this beautiful resilience with keeping the traditions alive of going into a pub and having a beer or having several, and you just chat. And that's the, you know, the living room of the community. I think there's a parallel with tap rooms kind of having this resurgence that you're not going to watch a sports game or do this or do that. You're going to the pub to chat. You just have a beer and you end up meeting people, or you end up talking about things that you never would have planned. What was like the, and I'm, you know, you've been back over the years. What is it like to go to some of those traditional UK pubs?
Well, it's funny. There was a swing just about when I was leaving in 74, 75, away from the large breweries and back to the smaller craft breweries. And a lot of pubs at that time, if they had the room within their building, they would actually start their own small brewery if they were able to, you know, license-wise.
Yeah.
And they would develop their own small brewery, and they would sell their beer within the pub as well as the main, you know, brands from the larger breweries. And that was beneficial to them because the beer didn't go through the normal taxation process.
Yep.
They made more money on it. They were more flexible to make different types.
It's fresher, right?
It was fresher. And you found that a lot of locals would become so devoted to that home brewed beer that they would ignore the Stella Artois and whatever else was on tap.
Yeah.
And so a lot of pubs did this, and there was quite a movement, the camera movement, real ale movement, and unfortunately, a lot of the British pubs that were tied to breweries did morph into kind of trendy, loud music, kind of, food within the facility, less traditional. But you can still find traditional pubs within England all over the place. Whenever I go back, I usually stay with my middle sister. She lives in Kent, a little village called Kemsing. And there is a pub there that is quite quirky. It's reputed to have been a house that was used by King Henry VIII when he was, let's say, walking outside of his marriage vows, and he would be spending time there. It's called the Rising Sun in Kemsing. And if anybody's listening and they want to Google that, they will understand what I mean when I say it's very quirky. The current publican who owns it, a woman, her husband died some years ago. She actually has a dairy farm attached to the pub.
Oh, wow.
And quite often you'll walk in the pub and there is no one behind the bar, but there's a buzzer. And if you push the buzzer, she'll come in from feeding the cows or dealing with the cows. She'll give you your beer, pull your beer, with a traditional beer engine, and then go back out to the farm again and leave you. And quite often she will say, if I'm not back in time and you want another drink, just hop around the bar, pull a pint and put your money in the pot. So, these places do still exist.
Yeah. That's glorious. I think that's part of why I liked, Arcadia, when Arcadia was a pub before, it's a brew pub or a brewery now, but it was just a pub on 124th Street. They do a private event every once in a while if it was Christmas or something like that, friends and family. And it was just like, mark down what you had and, pay your bill when you're done kind of thing. And and once or twice he'd be like, hey, I gotta, if he was solo, it's a quiet night and I got busy. Hey, Andrew, I gotta make a pizza. Like if someone needs a beer, hop around and pour beer and mark down for people. And,
it's the honest system.
Right? Yeah.
While we're talking about tradition, I should just briefly tell you, just an interesting fact. The pub that my father had last of all was called the Ramsalt Arms, and it was on the River Deben in Suffolk. But my brother, a year or so ago, he emailed me and he said, guess what? Dad's pub is in a movie. And so it ends up that they chose the Ramsalt Arms on the River Deben to be featured in that movie. Have you seen that?
And sorry, you cut out just for a second. In which movie was it featured?
It was called Yesterday. It was about a young fella who he fell off his bike and injured his head, and in his head he went back in time, and he was the author of all the Beatles songs. You haven't seen the movie?
No, I haven't. No.
Called Yesterdays. Well, the Ramsalt Arms, the pub my father used to have and that I used to pour beer in, is in the opening scenes of that movie.
Oh, cool.
The very opening scenes, yeah. So, cool. It's a great movie. You should watch it. I'm surprised you haven't watched it.
I haven't watched very many new movies or new to me movies in quite some time. I keep going back to my favorites when I do enjoy a movie, but I'll definitely at least go watch the opening scene so I can see the pub you used to pull.
Ramsalt Arms. I don't know if it's still got the name on it, but how's your beer anyway?
Disappearing quickly, which means we're running out of time. We're getting close. Time flies when you're learning all the things. So yeah, this beer is tasty. I'd love to have a chip, but actually I gotta have a supply. I've got
Dorito. Well,
I like having.
Believe it or not, these were introduced me last year, I think.
The Hawkeye
by Mark, who works here.
Yeah.
And they're very, very addictive.
It's the crunch and the salt for the Hawkins cheesy. So when you have a pint, your pint disappears a little quicker when you're munching those. A fun fact about that family that owns that business, They have no interest in growing and no interest in producing more chips. They make what they make. So they're done, I believe, Friday at noon, and they can have Friday afternoon off, all their staff and themselves, and the weekend off. And that's the way they like it. So they only sell that amount of chips, and then that's it. And I think there's something, I don't know, romantic about finding an equilibrium and then really creating a business that supports, you know, yourself and your employees' lifestyle. It's not just all about all the hours take over the world.
Yeah.
There's growth, acquisition.
Yeah, no, I'm with that. I'm with that. But I must admit, you know, 46 years in Canada, and for the first 44, maybe even 45, I hadn't tried those. And maybe that's a good thing, because I'd probably be weighing about 450 pounds.
Yeah, I do those every once in a while, but I hear you. They're a good treat every once in a while. So, last thing I was going to ask you, because time flies, we usually go 40, 45 minutes, and it's been 40 minutes already, if you can believe it. My last question for you is, what would you like to see happen in Alberta beer moving forward?
Well, I'd like to see, I mean, obviously, you know, if COVID could disappear and, you know, allow the current industry to develop the way it was before, that would be great. I do believe that there is still room for expansion, and maybe with some government relaxation of certain, you know, archaic rules around alcohol and eating, and, you know, what you can do around facilities and not.
Yeah.
I think we could end up with something akin to a pub culture that there is in England, you know, developed locally. Yeah. I think what you're describing, you know, the local where people go to socialize and also drink the good beer, but drink the good beer and enjoy it, and, you know, for what it is. I'm not keen on, you know, the large facilities that have, like I say, I mean, I shouldn't badmouth Stella Artois, but, you know, like, you can, they're like the cheaper lagers and the, you know, something with character like this, you know, that people can sit down and enjoy and savor, maybe with some complimentary foods. I think if we could get something like that going, it would be great, you know, even neighborhood style.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. And I think
it's going to take the provincial government to make some changes to their current laws so that we can be treated like adults and have that kind of facility here.
You know, more decriminalization basically of alcohol in public. Like, let's say a bar is full and you're like, oh, I want to go outside, and whether you smoke a cigarette or you just want to breathe some fresh air, and you step outside and your pint's in your hand, like, as long as you're not causing ruckus, you're not, you know, head over ass on the curb or whatever, like, you know, let us be responsible. Let's us have a beer in a park with no worries of looking over your shoulder or hiding in a coffee mug or whatever. I'm with you. I think, you know, if it's like a foreign concept to go to a brewery or a pub here and there's no food menu, like, you don't need food, just go have a beer or two and have a chat, right? Like, that's it is archaic. You're absolutely right. Our rules are based off of prohibition, which ended in 1925, I believe.
I can't recall, but it was quite some time ago. I think it would be a good move if we could relax a little more. And, you know, I mean, there's certain limitations, as you say. But I mean, if you're going to go to a campsite and have a beer, or, you know, even take a little keg and, you know, have a family get together, this is great. But it's, you know, it's funny, you can't go to a pub in England and be a stranger. As soon as you walk in, if you're by yourself, and I've done this, you know, the barman's gonna start talking to you, someone next to you, you know, where are you from? What are you doing here? How long are you staying? Like, it's just a very social place in the UK. You really do feel like it's your, as in England, they call it your living room, right? And it's a very friendly place.
Yeah, I had that when I was in Ireland many years ago, and especially in the smaller towns. I was in Galway for a few days, but even before that, we were in Limerick, which is like 90,000 people or something. And yeah, it's a Monday night, whatever, and a couple Canadians walking in just to have some pints and where are you from and what you doing, and they're just friendly. They genuinely, they're not just trying to like, you know, take advantage of it. They genuinely like, we've never seen you here before. We know you don't live in the neighborhood. Like, welcome. Like, what are you doing? What's up? They genuinely care and they want to get to know you and what's going on, right?
And before you know it, you've been invited in for a meal and maybe even proposed to by the daughter.
Yeah. So, how'd you get married overseas? Funny story. It starts with a pint.
It all started at the pub.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Awesome, man. Well, time flies. Anything else you want to share with the craft beer drinkers and listeners of the province?
Not really. Beyond what I said earlier on is, I mean, we're here as a resource for you, you know, whether it be wine, beer, cider, whatever. And, you know, if there's something that anybody wants, please just mention it, because we have several wholesalers we deal with both in Canada and the US. And if we can find it, we'll bring it in for you. No problem. We really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. The only thing, as I say, is we may have to expand here because we're running out of room.
Yeah, that's the challenge, is managing growth, essentially, right?
It's a good problem to have, I must admit.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
It was a treat. Cheers, my friend.
Yes, cheers. Here's looking up your address.
Yes. Clink.